The morning sun crept through the lace curtains of Evelyn's bedroom, casting delicate shadows across the quilt she'd sewn with Thomas 20 years ago. She sat beside him, her hand wrapped around his, feeling the faint pulse that had grown weaker each day. Thomas's breathing was shallow now, a rasp that filled the quiet room. The hospice nurse had left an hour ago, saying it wouldn't be long. Evelyn didn't cry. She'd spent her tears over the months of his illness, watching cancer steal the man who'd once carried her over puddles in his work boots, laughing like they were kids. Now at 58 she felt ancient, her heart heavy with a love that would soon have nowhere to go. "Evie," Thomas whispered, his voice barely a thread. "You'll be okay. You're stronger than you know." She squeezed his hand, her throat tight. "Don't talk like that, Tommy. Just rest." But he didn't rest. His eyes, cloudy but still his, held hers for a moment longer before they closed. The room grew still, the rasp fading into silence. Evelyn sat frozen, waiting for another breath that never came. She pressed her forehead to his hand, warm but lifeless, and let out a sound she didn't recognize. A keening that came from somewhere deep. Thomas was gone. The hours that followed were a blur. Neighbors arrived with casseroles and condolences, their voices soft and practiced. Evelyn moved through the motions, nodding at their words, accepting hugs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Her daughter, Sarah, was away with her husband on a work trip, leaving Evelyn to care for their children Lily and Max, who played quietly in the living room, unaware of the void that had opened in their grandmother's world. The house, once filled with Thomas's laughter and the clatter of his tools, felt like a shell. By afternoon the crowd thickened. The small town of Willow Creek turned out in force, as it always did for one of its own. Evelyn stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of coffee no one would drink, when she heard the familiar rumble of a truck pulling into the driveway. Her stomach tightened. Carl, Thomas's older brother, stepped through the door, his broad shoulders filling the frame. At 62, he carried himself like a man who knew he could command a room. His smile was wide, but Evelyn had always seen the edge beneath it, sharp as a blade when he'd had too much whiskey. "Evie," he said, his voice booming as he crossed the kitchen. "I'm so sorry. Tommy was," he trailed off, shaking his head. "He was the best of us." Evelyn nodded, her hands trembling as she poured coffee into a mug. "Thank you, Carl." She kept her eyes on the counter, avoiding his gaze. She'd never liked him, not since the early days of her marriage when he'd made crude jokes at her expense or lingered too long with a hand on her shoulder. Thomas had always brushed it off. Carl was just Carl, he'd say, rough around the edges but harmless. Evelyn wasn't so sure. The day wore on, and the house emptied as evening fell. Lily and Max were tucked into the guest room, their soft snores a small comfort. Evelyn was alone in the kitchen, washing dishes to keep her hands busy, when Carl reappeared. He'd been in and out all day, offering help, carrying chairs, playing the role of grieving brother. Now his eyes were glassy, his breath sharp with liquor. "You don't have to do that," he said, leaning against the counter. "Let me take care of you, Evie. You've been through enough." "I'm fine," she said, her voice clipped. She scrubbed a plate harder than necessary, the sponge squeaking against the porcelain. "You should go home, Carl. It's late." He didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "You don't mean that. You're all alone now. You need someone." Evelyn's heart thudded, a warning she couldn't ignore. She set the plate down and turned to face him, forcing steel into her voice. "I said I'm fine. Go." His smile twisted, no longer charming. "Don't be like that, Evie. We're family." He reached for her arm, his grip firm, and she yanked away, stumbling against the counter. The air shifted, heavy with something she couldn't name but felt in her bones. She tried to move past him, but he blocked her path, his bulk a wall between her and the door. What happened next was a blur of fear and pain. Carl's words turned sharp, accusing her of thinking she was better than him, of pushing him away when he was just trying to help. His hands were on her, too strong, too fast. Evelyn fought, her nails digging into his arm, but he was bigger, angrier, and fueled by something darker than grief. The kitchen table scraped against the floor as she fell, her head striking the edge. Blood trickled down her temple, warm and sticky, and she tasted salt on her lips. When it was over, Carl stood over her, breathing hard. You tell anyone and you'll regret it, he said, his voice low and cold. No one will believe you. You're just a grieving widow, Evie. Keep it that way. He left her there, crumpled on the linoleum, the door slamming behind him. Evelyn lay still, her body aching, her mind a storm of shame and terror. She didn't know how long she stayed there, only that the clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Slowly, she dragged herself to her feet, her hands shaking as she wiped blood from her face. She moved to the sink, splashing cold water over her skin, scrubbing until it hurt. She couldn't let the children see her like this. She couldn't let anyone see. In the bathroom, she studied her reflection, bruises blooming on her arms, a cut above her eyebrow. She bandaged it as best she could, telling herself it was from a fall, a story she could sell if anyone asked. But the mirror didn't lie. It showed a woman broken, not just by the loss of her husband, but by the betrayal of someone she was supposed to trust. She thought of Thomas, of his words that morning. You're stronger than you know. She didn't feel strong. She felt like nothing at all. Evelyn crept to the guest room, checking on Lily and Max. Their small forms were curled under the blankets, safe and unaware. She sank into a chair beside them, her body trembling. The weight of Carl's threat hung over her, as did the town's unspoken rule. Family matters stayed private. Willow Creek was a place where secrets were currency, traded in whispers at the diner or church. If she spoke out, would anyone believe her? Would they see her as a victim or a troublemaker, tarnishing Thomas's memory? She thought of Sarah, her daughter, who would be back in a few days. Sarah idolized her Uncle Carl, the fun-loving uncle who'd taught her to fish. Evelyn's heart ached at the thought of shattering that image. But the alternative, silence, was a poison she wasn't sure she could swallow. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep, but the night offered no peace. Images of Carl's face, twisted with rage, mingled with memories of Thomas's smile, now lost forever. By dawn, Evelyn was back in the kitchen, moving mechanically. She made pancakes for the children, forcing a smile as Lily chattered about school and Max drew pictures of dinosaurs. She felt like an actor in a play, reciting lines that didn't belong to her. The bruises were hidden under long sleeves, the cut covered with a bandage she claimed was from a clumsy moment with a cabinet door. The lie came easily, but it burned. As the children ate, Evelyn stood at the window watching the sun rise over the fields. The world looked the same, golden light, rolling hills, the distant hum of a tractor, but she was different. Something had fractured inside her, and she didn't know if it could be mended. Yet, as she watched Lily laugh at Max's attempt to stack pancakes into a tower, a spark flickered in her chest. She was their grandmother, their protector. She had been Thomas's wife, his partner through decades of love and loss. She wasn't nothing. Not yet. The chapter closed with Evelyn sitting at the kitchen table after the children had gone to play, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee. She thought of Carl's threat, of the town's judging eyes, of the life she'd built with Thomas now lying in ruins. But she also thought of Lily's laughter, of Max's drawings, of the promise she'd made to herself to keep going. She didn't know how, but she would find a way. For them. For Thomas. For herself. The week after Thomas's death passed like a fog, each day blending into the next. Evelyn rose before dawn, her body aching from bruises she hid under long sleeves and a scarf she knotted tightly around her neck. The mirror in the bathroom told a story she didn't want to read, purple marks fading to yellow, a cut above her eyebrow scabbing over. She'd told Lily and Max it was from a fall, a clumsy moment with a cabinet door, and they'd accepted it with the trust only children have. But their wide eyes lingered on her, especially Lily's, and Evelyn wondered how much they sensed. The house was too quiet without Thomas's voice, his off-key humming while he fixed the porch swing or his laughter at Max's dinosaur impressions. Evelyn filled the silence with routine. She woke the children at 7, made pancakes shaped like hearts for Lily and dinosaurs for Max, and drove them to school in Thomas's old pickup, the engine rattling like it shared her grief. She smiled through their chatter, nodding at Lily's stories about her teacher and Max's plans to build a fort. But inside she was unraveling, Carl's voice echoing in her head. You tell anyone and you'll regret it. Willow Creek was a town where secrets grew like weeds, tangled and hard to uproot. Evelyn knew the rules. Family stayed family, and dirty laundry stayed behind closed doors. She'd seen it before. A neighbor's black eye explained away as a fall, a hushed argument at the church picnic ignored. Carl was a fixture here, the charming brother of the town's beloved mechanic, known for his booming laugh and quick temper. If she spoke out, would anyone believe her? Or would they whisper that she was a grieving widow? Imagining things to fill the void Thomas left? On Wednesday, Evelyn needed air. She bundled the children into their coats and walked them to the diner on Main Street, a place where the coffee was strong and the gossip stronger. The bell above the door jangled as they entered, and heads turned, old men at the counter, mothers with strollers, the usual crowd. Evelyn felt their eyes, not unkind but searching, as if they could see the cracks in her facade. She settled Lily and Max into a booth with crayons and menus to color, then slid in beside them, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Evie, you holdin' up?" Ruth's voice cut through the diner's hum. She stood by the booth, her gray hair pulled into a bun, her nurse's hand still steady despite retirement. Ruth had been Evelyn's friend since high school, the one who'd brought soup when Thomas got sick, who'd sat with her during chemo appointments. She was the only one Evelyn might have told, if she could find the words. "I'm managing," Evelyn said, forcing a smile. "Kids keep me busy." Ruth's eyes narrowed, taking in the scarf, the long sleeves despite the warm September day. "You don't look right, Evie. You sleepin'?" Evelyn shrugged, her fingers twisting the edge of her napkin. "Not much. It's hard." Ruth slid into the booth, her voice low. "Grief's a beast, but this is something else. You can talk to me, you know." Evelyn's throat tightened. She wanted to spill it all, the kitchen, Carl's hands, the blood, but fear clamped her mouth shut. Instead she said, "Just tired, Ruth. That's all." Ruth didn't push, but her gaze lingered, sharp and knowing. The conversation shifted to the children, to the weather, to the memorial service planned for Thomas at the church. But Evelyn felt the weight of Ruth's unspoken questions, and it followed her as she paid the bill and walked the children home. That night, after Lily and Max were asleep, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, the same table where it had happened. She traced the scratches in the wood, her fingers trembling. The house creaked around her, amplifying her loneliness. She thought of Thomas, of how he'd always known when she was hurting, even when she didn't say it. "What do I do, Tommy?" she whispered, her voice breaking. There was no answer, only the tick of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. The next day, the memorial service loomed. Evelyn dressed carefully, choosing a navy blouse that covered her bruises and a skirt that felt like armor. She braided Lily's hair and tied Max's shoes, her hands steady despite the churn in her stomach. The church was packed, the pews filled with faces she'd known for decades, farmers, teachers, the postman who delivered Thomas's hospital bills. They stood to sing Amazing Grace, and Evelyn's voice faltered, her eyes stinging as she remembered Thomas humming it in the garden. Carl was there, of course, standing at the front with the pastor, his face a mask of sorrow. He spoke about Thomas, his voice thick with emotion, calling him the brother who kept us grounded. The crowd nodded, some wiping tears, and Evelyn's stomach twisted. She gripped the pew, her knuckles white as Carl's eyes found hers. His expression didn't change, but the message was clear. Keep quiet. She looked away, her heart pounding, and focused on Lily's small hand in hers. After the service, people milled in the churchyard, sharing stories about Thomas. Evelyn stood by a table of cookies and punch, nodding as folks offered condolences. Carl approached, a paper cup in his hand, his smile too wide. "Evie, you did Tommy proud today," he said, loud enough for others to hear. Then quieter so only she could hear. "Let's keep it that way, yeah?" She froze, her breath catching. He clapped her shoulder, a gesture that looked brotherly to the crowd but felt like a warning. She wanted to scream, to shove him away, but the eyes of Willow Creek were on her, and she couldn't afford to break. Not here. Not yet. That evening, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She wandered the house, ending up in Thomas's workshop, where his tools still hung neatly on the wall. She touched his hammer, its handle worn smooth from years of use, and felt a pang of loss so sharp it stole her breath. But something else stirred, a spark of anger, not just at Carl but at herself for staying silent. She couldn't keep living like this, hiding in her own home, afraid of a man who'd taken enough from her. The next morning, after dropping the children at school, Evelyn drove to the library on the edge of town. It was a small building, its shelves sagging with books and a single computer in the corner. She sat at a table, her hands shaking as she flipped through a pamphlet she'd found tucked among the self-help books. Resources for survivors of domestic violence. The words felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else's life. But as she read about hotlines, shelters, and legal options, a small flame of possibility flickered. She slipped the pamphlet into her purse, her heart racing as if she'd stolen something. Back home, Evelyn began to write. In a notebook she kept hidden in her bedside drawer, she poured out the truth, the kitchen, the pain, Carl's threats. Each word felt like a rebellion, a way to reclaim what he'd tried to take. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the pages were smudged with tears. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. On Friday, Lily came home with a drawing. A stick figure with gray hair and a cape, labeled Strong Grandma. She handed it to Evelyn with a shy smile. "That's you," she said. "You're the strongest person I know." Evelyn's eyes burned. She hugged Lily tightly, the drawing crinkling between them. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered. The words sank deep, stirring something she hadn't felt since Thomas's death. Resolve. She wasn't strong yet, but she wanted to be. For Lily, for Max, for the woman she'd been before that night. That evening, Evelyn stood at Thomas's grave, the air cool and sharp with the scent of pine. The cemetery was quiet, the headstone still fresh with his name. Thomas William Harper, beloved husband and father. She knelt, her fingers tracing the letters. "I'm trying, Tommy," she said. "I don't know how, but I'm going to fight. For us. For the kids." The wind carried her words away, but she felt lighter, as if she'd made a vow she couldn't break. She didn't know what came next, whether she'd call the number in the pamphlet, tell Ruth, or face Carl. But as she walked back to the house, Lily's drawing tucked in her pocket, she felt a shift. The silence was still heavy, but it wasn't absolute. Somewhere beneath the fear, her strength was waiting. 3 months had passed since Thomas's death, and Evelyn was learning to live with the weight of her secret. The bruises had faded, but the memory of that night in the kitchen lingered like a bruise on her soul. She'd kept up appearances, cooking for Lily and Max, attending church, nodding at neighbors' questions about how she was holding up. But inside she was a storm, anger and fear swirling in equal measure. The pamphlet from the library was now dog-eared, hidden in her drawer beside the notebook where she'd written every detail of Carl's assault. Those pages were her rebellion, her proof that she wasn't imagining it, no matter how many times she doubted herself. Sarah and her husband Mark had returned from their trip, but the children stayed with Evelyn on weekends, a routine that anchored her. She'd started seeing a counselor at a women's shelter in the next town. A 40-minute drive she made in secret. The counselor, a woman named Linda with kind eyes and a voice like warm tea, listened without judgment. "What happened to you was real," Linda said at their first session. "And it wasn't your fault." The words felt like a lifeline, though Evelyn wasn't sure she believed them yet. Linda helped her see the bigger picture. "Speaking out isn't just about you," she said one rainy afternoon. "It's about protecting others who might cross his path." The idea struck Evelyn like a match. She'd been so focused on her own survival, her fear of Carl, of the town's judgment, that she hadn't considered others. The thought that she could stop him, that her voice could matter, planted a seed of courage. Evelyn began to build her case. She retrieved medical records from the clinic she'd visited the morning after the assault, claiming a fall had caused her injuries. The nurse had raised an eyebrow but didn't press, and the records noted a cut, bruising, and a mild concussion. Evelyn photocopied them, adding them to her notebook. She also wrote down every interaction with Carl since that night, the memorial, his veiled threats, the way he'd linger at family dinners watching her. Each entry was a brick in a wall she was building, one she hoped would be strong enough to hold him accountable. One crisp October morning, Evelyn was at the grocery store when she ran into Clara, a former neighbor who'd moved away years ago. Clara was older now, her hair streaked with silver, but her eyes held a familiar wariness. They exchanged small talk, but when Clara mentioned Carl in passing, "He always gave me the creeps," Evelyn's heart skipped. She invited Clara for coffee, and in the quiet of her kitchen, the truth spilled out. Clara had been through something similar with Carl a decade ago, when he'd cornered her after a town dance. She'd never reported it, silenced by shame and fear of disbelief. "You're not alone," Clara said, her voice trembling. And neither am I guess. The words bound them, two women carrying the same wound. They agreed to act together to go to the police with their stories. It wasn't easy. Clara's hand shook as she spoke, and Evelyn felt the old fear rise. But their shared resolve was stronger. They met with Linda, who connected them with a lawyer who specialized in abuse cases. The lawyer was blunt. It would be hard, especially in a town like Willow Creek, but their combined accounts could make a difference. The turning point came at a family gathering in November, a potluck at Sarah's house to celebrate Max's 6th birthday. The backyard was filled with relatives, neighbors, and the smell of barbecue. Carl was there, laughing with Sarah's husband, a beer in his hand. Evelyn watched him, her stomach churning. She'd planned to wait to let the lawyer handle things, but seeing him act like nothing had happened, like he hadn't shattered her, ignited something fierce. She stood, her chair scraping against the deck, and the chatter fell silent. All eyes turned to her, and she felt the weight of them. Sarah's confusion, Mark's concern, the neighbor's curiosity. Carl's smile faltered, but he kept his gaze steady, daring her to speak. I have something to say, Evelyn began, her voice shaking but clear. She took a breath, her hands clenched at her sides. Carl, you hurt me. The night Thomas died, you came into my home and you? She faltered, the words catching, but she forced them out. You assaulted me. You left me bleeding on my kitchen floor. And you told me no one would believe me. But I'm done being afraid. The backyard was silent, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the wind. Sarah's face paled, her eyes darting to Carl. Mark stepped closer, his jaw tight. Carl laughed, a harsh sound, and held up his hands. Evie, come on. You're grieving. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, she said, her voice steady now. And I'm not the only one. Clara, tell them. Clara stood, her hands trembling but her voice firm. He did it to me 2 years ago. I didn't speak up then, but I am now. The crowd murmured, some shocked, others skeptical, but Evelyn felt a shift. The truth was out. A stone dropped into still water, sending ripples in every direction. Carl's face darkened, and he took a step toward Evelyn, but Mark blocked him. That's enough, Mark said, his voice low. Sarah moved to Evelyn's side, her hand finding her mother's. Is this true? She whispered, tears in her eyes. Evelyn nodded and Sarah's grip tightened, a silent vow of support. The police were called that night. Carl was arrested, his protests loud but hollow. The town buzzed with the news, and Evelyn braced for the fallout. Some believed her, offering quiet support at the diner or church. Others whispered that she was stirring trouble, that Carl was just a flawed man. The skepticism stung, but Evelyn held her head high, bolstered by Sarah, Clara, and Ruth, who never left her side. The legal process was slow, a grind of statements and hearings. But Evelyn's and Clara's testimonies, backed by medical records and the notebook, were enough to charge Carl. Other women came forward, their stories echoing Evelyn's, painting a picture of a man who'd used his charm to hide his cruelty. Willow Creek was forced to reckon with its silence, and though change was slow, it began. By spring, Evelyn stood in her backyard, planting a garden with Lily and Max. The soil was rich, the air warm with promise. Lily handed her a marigold, its petals bright against the earth. It's like you, Grandma, she said. It's tough, but it's pretty. Evelyn smiled, her heart full imagined.